I want to say to all of you, thank you for your advocacy for the protection of our springs as well as all of our water resources. And first I want to tell you a little bit about myself because sometimes when you hear a message, you ask yourself, well, who's telling me the message? And as Clay has said, I'm David Simmons. I grew up on a farm in Tennessee, and I must have been sometimes in the summer 14, 16 hours a day working, particularly driving a tractor. And I remember thinking to myself that we used to joke about it, that what was vacation? That's what other people took. And what was Saturday? Oftentimes just another work day. But I went on to Tennessee Technological University, and in mathematics was first in my class, and then went on to Vanderbilt Law School and came down, and because of the way that I believe that Abraham Lincoln was, emulating him, I ran for office. I was elected in 2000 to the House and spent 8 years in the House, took a couple of years off, and then ran for the Florida Senate, and was elected in 2010 and have been in the Senate since. And in that time period have been able to obviously effectuate some change. One of them is through just hard work, the Orlando Sentinel. And I love to tell the story. It is true. Said that, and we're talking about my being a workhorse in the legislature, and they said that Simmons is the definition of substance over style. And so what happened is that my daughter said, Dad, that is so easy, you have no style. And so the truth of it is that I've been a firm believer in you can't get to the policy until you get past the personalities. And you can't let personalities get in the way of policy. And in doing that, I've done a lot of work across the aisle. And I've tried to be reasonable in the approaches that I have taken. And in the summer of 2013, when I saw the continual reports as to what was happening with respect to our springs, I began a determined effort to do something about it. And I want you to know that when I first started, using the theory that I've always used, I said, well, let's get everybody together and let's talk to the environmental advocates. They believe strongly in this, and I talked to business interests, and I talked to agricultural interests. And what I found was that there was so much distrust between the two sides that sometimes when I started out, when I was talking to the environmental advocates, if I suggested something that the business interests were willing to do, or I thought they would do, the answer was, we're not going to do that. And I'd say, why? Because if it's coming from the other side, then there must be something wrong with it. And the same thing was said by those in the business interests. And they were equally as distrustful of those who were environmental advocates. And you ask yourself, why are we where we are today? I can tell you that there's a great book that Michael Grunwald has written called The Swamp. It's a book about the Everglades. And the fact is that there was a different time. I don't consider all of where we are today to be some kind of intentional neglect. I consider it to be a circumstance in which, with respect to the Everglades, back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, the view was that that was a godforsaken swamp that needed to be drained. And Napoleon Bonaparte Brouwer ran for governor and was elected in 1904 on the platform of draining that godforsaken swamp. What's happened is that people came here in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and then, of course, with the discovery, invention, I guess is what you would say, of air conditioning, the end result of it is that a huge number of people came here. And what worked back then, because of the number of people, doesn't work today. And it's incredibly important that we realize that there is a different world today when you have 20 million people living in the state of Florida, and that you just can't do it like you used to do it. And there now is an appreciation for the beauty and the wonder of the Everglades, and obviously the need to preserve our springs. Now, our springs are nothing other than a window from our Florida aquifer. That's exactly what they are. If the Florida aquifer is in fact troubled, you'll find that our springs are going to be even more trouble, because that's all this is the Florida aquifer flowing out. And what are the contributors? We know what the contributors are. We know that it is, in fact, some agriculture. We know that it is the runoff that we have from city streets. We know that it involves the wastewater treatment that our local governments have done. And we also know that septic tanks are a significant contributor to this. And so when I began in 2013 to try to tackle this issue, what happened is that using a theory that you can get to the policy if you get past the personalities and you try to move people to some place in the middle, not because you're compromising on your principles, but because different people have different positions, and sometimes you have to do things in increments. And so the Senate, with the help of, there were 5 senators, and tireless advocates such as yourself, we were able to pass in the Senate a Springs Protection Act. That is truly the basis of what the Springs and Aquifer Protection Act of 2016 was. And what happened is that we got it through the Senate, and then because persistence erodes resistance, we came back the next year when the House wouldn't take it up. And then that was 2014. Then in 2015, we did it again. And we passed it again in the Senate. And then what happened is when we got into further part of late 2015 and early part of 2016, and by the way, you remember how tough things were when the House and the Senate in 2015 got tied up in, I guess what you'd call crossways, on the issue of expansion of health care. And so the House adjourned early, and we didn't pass what we wanted to pass. And what happened is that after that, I realized that we needed to work together. And so I met with the governor, and to his great credit, he said, David, whatever we need to do to get good policy done on this and other issues, he was for it. And anybody who wanted to stand up and talk bad about each other in the House or the Senate, I don't care if it's Democrat or Republican, I tell you what, he was good enough to let me send somebody down to his office so they could tell him to his face. And so what happened is that between the House and the Senate and the governor, there began to have the working relationship that is so important to getting things solved. And I'm talking about across the aisle. I'm talking about working together. And so what happened is Democrats and Republicans joined behind the need to have a solution to protecting our water resources, because you know what? This is all we got. This is all we have, and if we don't protect our springs, we don't protect our Florida aquifer, the Biscayne aquifer, if we don't protect our Everglades, we don't have a second chance at this. And I know that the way we got to where we are is because it used to be that people believed that we could continue to do the way we did before. And that, as I pointed out to people, engineers. I mean, when I started on this, engineers for cities were fighting me because, they'd been doing it a certain way, taking wastewater that was not fully treated and had as much as 10 to 14 or 15 milligrams per liter of nitrates, in which that the standard for coming out of the springs to keep a springs clean is clay 0.35. And we're talking about they're putting into the Florida aquifer something like 15 milligrams per liter. How do you expect it when it comes out of the springs to be able to to be able to be clean, the kind of environment that you want? And the answer is that when they all started, they thought the Florida aquifer was so great and so big, and that the impact was so little that it would, in fact, be appropriate or acceptable. Well, I pointed out to them, I said, dilution is not the solution to pollution. I said, ultimately, you're drinking out of our own toilet. I said, we can't do this. I said, there are too many people for you to use an engineering plan that there's just so much water down there that the impact will not be significant enough to make a difference. Well, we know that that doesn't work. So we have to do things differently. My goal is that all water that is distributed, discharged by our local governments is going to be potable. That's what we need. It needs to be potable. Because what we dump out is going to be what we take back. And so I tell you that you can be satisfied, but not. I'll change that. You can be happy that this has been done this far, but not satisfied. Because the simple fact of it is, we did hit a home run in 2016. We hit a home run. But it's the only thing it is a home run in the first inning of a 9-inning game. That's what's happening. We've got a lot of follow-through to do. The issue of septic tanks, I want to talk to you because Clay has been a tireless advocate on that. The fact of it is that when I try to make a set of standards, and we do have standards that we're going to be adopting, and we're going to have some really good standards that put together a long-term, and it has to be long-term. You can't take the infrastructure of our cities with respect to their wastewater treatment and tell them to change it next year. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars ultimately. And this has to be done over a period of time. And so we use the system that the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People uses. And that is first things first. So we're going to solve the first things first. And then start the project with the end in mind. And if you don't have a time period and you don't have an end in mind, then you don't know where you're going. And so we're having the requirement that all local governments put together a plan, working with the water management districts and the DEP, to have a 20-year plan to get this solved. When I started out, I had people from various agencies telling me, you can't set a time period. It's just too much. And my answer in response to them was, you'll never solve it if you don't have a time period. And you'll never solve it unless you have a plan. And we'll change that plan as we go along. Every few years, every 5 years, we'll reinvestigate it, reevaluate it with more technology. But if we don't have a plan today, we'll not have a solution tomorrow. And we certainly won't have a solution in 20 years. But it's realistic. It's realistic to put a realistic time frame on this and put requirements to get the project done. That's what this bill does. And the important part of it is, with respect to Springs, as Clay has said, we were able to take $50 million a year and allocate it to Springs restoration and preservation. Now that, my friends, is a home run. Because that is significant. In over 20 years, that's $1 billion towards Springs restoration. That is no small feat. Now, what do we have to do? We have to do what you're doing, and that is continue on. Continue on with the advocacy that you are doing. Continue on with the concept that we have to not let our guard down, that we in fact are going to demand of our public officials, our senators, our representatives, our governor, everyone who's involved in government, that it is essential for us to have, for the future of Florida. We have 350,000 people moving here, net gain a year. They're coming here for a reason. They're coming here because it's a beautiful place to live. Our water is the essence of our future. And as Clay has said, it's not going to be just the nitrates that are put in our water by whether it's septic tanks. We're going to have to work, and we've made a big step with respect to septic tanks. I can't help but tell you a quick story about septic tanks. And that is that when we started on trying to solve the issue of septic tanks, there are certain people who live in neighborhoods who become very inflamed about even discussing it. They become very angry, and they'll go from house to house saying that, you realize that the legislature is going to require you to pay $20,000 to change your septic tank and take it out. And there's a lot of misinformation, a tremendous amount of misinformation, and people get upset. The important thing for us to do is reach a solution with respect to that, and have a reasonable solution. First thing you do when you're in a hole and you're 6 feet under, what do? Quit digging. You quit digging. So what we do is, we've got all of these septic tanks in this state. What you do is you start in the future from now and try to limit the number of septic tanks that we use, or either get septic tanks that in fact are not going to be environmentally dangerous. So what you do is you quit digging. And so you go ahead and start doing this in increments. Because if you demand immediate relief on everything, you'll find out you get nothing. And that's what's happened for 30 or 40 years. Is if you ask for the whole loaf, you end up finding that you get no loaf. And that's what's happened here, and that's what, much to the credit of certain environmental advocates. They understood that this is a process. They understood that this bill was in fact a home run, and that we'll come back next year and we're going to do even better and do more. But certainly what we have done is a roadmap for Florida's future, and a program and a process to assure that Florida's future is going to be intact. Now, with that being said, I'm happy to answer questions and say to all of you, thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting what has been a real journey in trying to educate people about the very things that you know about already, and the importance of this, and the situation. Let me tell you about. It's just more than nitrates. I wanted to do the digression. You think about the amount of pharmaceuticals that we all take. Where's that going? Right down the toilets. And where does it all ultimately go? It goes through the water processing, or it goes through your septic tanks, and then it's going to find its way, because you know what happens is that water like that ultimately goes down to the hawthorn layer, which is a clay layer of that is where above it is the superficial aquifer. Then it finds a hole, namely some kind of break in it from whether it's of any kind, sinkhole, anything like that, and then it just pours right on down to the Florida aquifer. And you can imagine the amount of pharmaceuticals that, because the unique way our water is and where we're getting it from the Florida aquifer for everything that's around Central Florida, north to the Georgia line is there's a challenge we've all got, and we're going to have to address it. We're going to have to address it. But that and the nitrates, what we're doing is we have a plan, and we're going to do something about it, and we are doing something about it. And again, thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for being a tireless advocate. And I see that Heidi, City Commissioner, and Del she's a tireless advocate as well. I've worked with her. So thanks to all of you. I appreciate your support. I appreciate what you're doing.
You got a question for him? We're running a little behind. But
yes, sir.
Yes, Senator. What can we do to keep the fracking chemicals from adding to the problems that we have now in the state of Florida?
And you know, I met with the Conservancy and Southwest Florida representatives just about 2 weeks ago on this. And I think we've reached a consensus as to how to do this. First, I want to start out by saying to everybody, I don't know how fracking would work in the state of Florida. My common sense tells me that doesn't work. But I'm also a pragmatist and a person who believes in having some kind of basis for it. I know that I look at Oklahoma and other states, particularly Oklahoma, with the tremors that they're having, and they've been doing fracking, and they've got some really adverse results from what they've done. We don't have a situation where we can have any kind of, let's do it right the second time, or correct the problem. We've got a limestone base here in the state of Florida, and if we destroy it, I mean, it's no far out thing that we could be sinking into the sea, and we can certainly pollute a tremendous amount of our Florida aquifer. So my answer is that the solution to this is in fact to do a study, put a moratorium on any fracking. And by the way, there is no moratorium on fracking right now. As a matter of fact, the DEP stood in front of committee meetings and said that there is no prohibition against fracking here in the state of Florida. What happens is for them to stop fracking, there must be a showing that as to any particular company that is drilling, that it is environmentally harmful, it's harmful to the health, safety, and the welfare of the people of the state of Florida, which means, of course, getting some scientific information to show that they can't frack. So the answer is not to do nothing. Doing nothing is not a solution. What we need to do is put a moratorium on it, study it, and what do I believe that the study is going to show? It's going to show that there are going to be serious problems with it. But then I don't know. But I do believe that if in fact it is an open, thorough study that involves the people such as yourself and everyone else, and we don't rely upon just one person, but we rely upon a committee or a council to make a recommendation to the legislature. And this is the kind of situation where you have to weigh the risk against the benefits against the risk. And to me, I don't know how that personally the risks are going to be justified by the benefit. And so if there's any chance that this is going to go awry, we don't need to be doing it. And so those are my thoughts on it. I think we ought to have a moratorium. Right now we don't, and we need to.
One more question.
I have a question about Lake Okeechobee. What do you think is going to be done about Lake Okeechobee and buying land in the south and stop diverting it?
Okay, did you hear the question? She asked, what about Okeechobee and the problem of Okeechobee, which of course is a situation which there are discharges that they make to try to keep Lake Okeechobee below a certain level, 15.5 feet, I believe is what it is, 14 feet above sea level of water, because they're making discharges. And by the way, if the discharges were not full of phosphorus, and phosphates are the big issue there, not so much nitrates, it goes into the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie rivers, and then, of course, creates these awful algae blooms. I'm going to try to summarize very quickly what is in an article that I wrote as a special for the Orlando Sentinel, a special article in August of this year. And the summary of that is that there can be close to an immediate solution to this problem. The biggest reservoir for that water, so that there do not have to be the discharges that are. I'm just going to talk to you out here. After the 1928, 1926 hurricanes came through South Florida, what happened is that flood control, which was not an issue for the federal government, many of the states asked for assistance from the federal government. And the federal government went ahead and got what is the arm of dealing with such kind of massive projects, which is the Corps of Engineers, to go ahead and begin the building of the Herbert Hoover Dike. And from 1930 up until probably close to the end of that decade, a massive water project was done, which was the building of the Herbert Hoover Dike on the south side of Lake Okeechobee. And what happened after that was, in order to continue the regulation of the layers, the level of the water, because naturally what happened before all of this is water just flowed. That was that river of grass that everybody talks about. The Everglades, the huge, almost 100-mile wide layer of water that flowed all the way to the South Florida. And that was from Lake Okeechobee. And so what happened is the Corps of Engineers stopped all of that. Why? Because people south and west of Lake Okeechobee, what happened is we created a huge, huge opportunity for agriculture, which at that time was seen as our manifest destiny, the building of Miami. All of those big cities that you talk about, they're there because of that big dike that stops the flow of water. But the problem is that that dike has not been maintained. You know that the Corps of Engineers has been making discharges that have caused algae blooms of devastating degrees since the 1950s. As a matter of fact, in 2009 and 2010, a group of private individuals who lived on St. Lucie River, riparian right holders, sued the Corps of Engineers and said, "You are taking our property by inverse condemnation by continuing to do these discharges." And do you know what the defense was by the Corps of Engineers? They said that they had been doing this for the last 50 or 60 years, and so that the statute of limitations had run. And the court agreed and said this is not for private individuals to be bringing this lawsuit. The fact of it is, however, is that the partnership between the state of Florida and the Corps of Engineers, the United States government, is one in which the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals has stated, in a case as recent as 2013, is that the Corps is there at the permission of the state of Florida. This is not something where there's a supremacy clause issue so that the federal government does it the way that the federal government wants to do, but then we can't do anything about it. So I have stated it is time, because if that dike is not repaired, and by the way, the Corps of Engineers admits that they have not maintained it the way they should. If it is in fact repaired, it'll cost between $800 million and $1 billion to do it. But you know what will happen? It'll save the lives of all these people who are to the south and the west. And what it'll also do is it'll permit the increase in the amount of water that is maintained. Rather than discharging it as often as they do, what will happen is they'll have a perfect reservoir. They can raise the height of the lake 372 square miles. And that's a lot of water. When you talk about just 1 foot and an acre feet, multiply 640 acres times 372 square miles, because there are 640 acres in a mile, in a square mile. And you'll find that you're talking about what, 475,000 acre feet? You're talking about a lot. You're talking about a lot of storage that can save the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie rivers and estuaries from the degradation that has been going on for 60 years. That's how you do it. And then you go ahead and build the other reservoirs that are necessary, and you also, believe it or not, 95% of the problems with respect to the continued degradation of Lake Okeechobee are coming from the north, from the Kissimmee River. It's not coming from the south. So the fact of it is that we can go ahead and solve this problem. We can begin immediately to demand, and if they don't do it, I propose, and I'm going to file legislation, I'm going to file a bill that demands that the Corps of Engineers stop the discharges and in fact, and reduce the discharges, and in fact begin immediately, because they are part of a partnership with us, to correct the problems with that dike so that we can have a natural reservoir. And their plan that they can't do this until 2025, which is the latest thing that they've said, that's bogus. That's bogus.